Hello, and thank you for joining me. My name is Kathy Ullman. I'm also known as Investigator Chick, and we're going to talk about communicating during an incident. So many of us, I think, are familiar with incidents, whether they're small or something really big. Pretty sure if you haven't been paying attention, you might not have seen stuff about maybe solar winds, because that's not a thing, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about communicating when you do have an incident, because we do talk a lot about incidents in terms of recovering from them and preventing them, but not so much about communicating during them. So here's our agenda. We're going to meet the sloth. We'll talk about why this particular subject matters. We'll talk a little about our strengths and weaknesses in InfoSec. There are some things we are incredibly good at doing, and there are some things that we could use some help with, and how those particular things help or detract us from this goal. Then we'll talk about communication at multiple levels. So very frequently, you will need to communicate in an organization up the chain, down the chain, sideways. So we're going to talk about how that communication differs. We'll talk a little about nonverbal communications, because that's just as important as our verbal communication. And then I'll give you some final thoughts. So here we go. Meeting the sloth. So this is a sloth from the Buffalo Zoo, where I adopted him. It's been almost 2 years now. His name is Flash. He's very sweet, and I'm very fond of sloths, so I almost always bring a sloth to the party, figuratively, of course. This is a little about me. I won't dwell on this. I have some degrees. I have some certifications. I help out with a whole bunch of stuff. And, so if you want to know more about me, you are welcome to Google and read more about this. I want to bring Hacking is Not a Crime to your attention very briefly. I think this is a very important organization. The idea being that, those of us who are hackers, what we do inherently is not a crime. However, the intent can change that, right? So if you're interested, I recommend you check us out at hackingisnotacrime.org. Moving on. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of this conversation. So motivation, why should we care about this subject? Well, this cat is very interested, clearly. But what are the odds? And this is not meant to be the scary slide. It's really just meant to point out the fact that, we can see patterns, right? There have been a number of breaches, and in 2018 to 19, we see breaches going up. And then from 2019 to 2020, the total number of breaches go down. So is that good? Does that mean things are getting better? Maybe. But I would say, I don't know, maybe it's just the kind of breaches that we're having and the way in which attackers are coming after our information is now focused more on something like ransomware. So the point of this slide is just to point out that there is an increased frequency of ransomware. As I mentioned earlier, the whole business with SolarWinds and all the things that have made the news lately have typically been some form of ransomware. So maybe we're not losing a gazillion records at a time. Maybe instead, we're being forced to deal with ransomware, and that's certainly a pattern that's going up. So the reality is that everybody's going to be dealing with incidents. So this is a quote from the former FBI director, and he argues that there's really only two kinds of companies: those who've been hacked and those who will be, and ultimately those who will be hacked and those who will be hacked again, right? And so the reality is this is everywhere. We're going to have an incident at some point, and really, if we take some time and we think through how we're going to communicate during that incident, we will be better prepared to deal with whatever comes down the pike, instead of being in a fearful tizzy running around like chickens with their heads cut off. All right, so this leads into our strengths and weaknesses in InfoSec. So as I mentioned earlier, folks who do this job tend to be really good at certain things, right? What are we good at? First of all, I want to point out that the reality is, while technology can play a role in solving some of the problems we see, like, ransomware or any other sort of attack, really we're dealing with people. And IT folks, InfoSec folks, not always so good at dealing with people. So if you really want to understand the security problem, you have to realize it's a people problem. So how does that tie back into this notion of what we're good at and what we're not good at? Well, here's what we're really good at doing. We are exceptional at fixing problems, right? Just like this little kitten. We can solve all the problems. You've got a break, we fix it. Especially in the defense universe. I mean, the offense folks, they like to break things. The defense folks have to figure out how to fix them. Although I have to give kudos, we are starting to see some folks in the offensive space providing, just as much usable information and intel about how they broke something to be able to help fix it, which is fantastic. So this is an area in which we really excel in general in the IT space and in InfoSec. This is unfortunately what we're not so good at. We do not excel at communicating with each other or with other people. And some of you may recognize this image. I would play a clip for you, but the clips, some of them are a little grainy, but this clip is from an old Saturday Night Live skit with this particular gentleman on the right plays Nick Burns, the computer guy. And what he does when he shows up at your desk as the worker person who's trying to get help is he belittles them, he talks down to them, and he says, move, right? If you're the person whose job it is to do the thing, you are there to write a Word document that describes a project that your organization is involved in. You're not there to do technical support. You rely on those of us in IT and in security to support you in some way. Well, Nick is terrible at that. And unfortunately, he represents a large chunk of us, right? I would like to think I'm not in that chunk. I've made a career out of going out of my way to try to explain things in terms that folks who are not technical understand. I came out of a support role before I moved into security. I was in support for a very long time. I started on the phones in a call center like many folks have. I did WordPerfect support. And, these people, they rely on you for help in the same way that we rely on other folks in other industries, plumbers, electricians, any sort of industry you can think of where we don't necessarily have that expertise. So when we do a poor job of communicating with folks, we set ourselves up for failure, and that's a problem. And it's especially a problem during an incident. So patience, they say it is not something that we often have a whole lot of. It's something that is hard to come by. And, I have felt this very angry way on occasion. And that's really hard because when you have to explain something for the 20th, 30th time, you don't really want to have to explain it again. And yet that is part of our job, right? Is that we have to explain things. We often have to explain them more than once. So what are the repercussions of us not communicating well with these folks? Well, there can be a loss of trust. And in reality, the security office in an organization, or even if you just have, some folks who are in a role, if there's no big organization, because this talk is meant to cover you whether you're in a tiny organization, maybe you're it, right? You're the only person in the job doing IT and security and you wear all the hats, right? Or maybe you're in a large organization where there is a full security office and a whole bunch of people doing all kinds of other types of support. It doesn't matter. What matters is that when you don't communicate well with people, you can lose their trust. And if they don't trust you, they won't tell you when something's wrong. And think about what happens if you don't know something's wrong, right? The folks who are out there are eyes and ears. We can look at logs all day long, but in many cases, the log tells us the bigger picture or can tip us off to some other piece. But maybe, just maybe, it's that individual who says, I see something weird. And that individual could either be somebody in the IT space, the InfoSec space, or none of the above. So it's important to keep their trust. Future communications will also be problematic. If I'm uncomfortable talking to you because you've belittled me or you've talked down to me in some way, I'm not going to want to pick up that phone and call you, right? I'm going to call somebody else for help. And maybe that person wasn't the best choice to call because maybe they don't have all the insight. So this is really important. You can be the cause of an additional conflict because again, now maybe they had a different phone call. They called somebody else and that person gave them inaccurate information. Now you have another conflict. There can be, in general, bad reputation vibes on a company if the communication about an incident in particular is poor. We've seen a lot of that, right? The intern did it. That caused all kinds of fantastic thumbs up. I don't know about you, but I really wasn't particularly happy to see that. There's going to be an overall decrease in morale because when people don't feel good about who they're working with and they don't feel like they can communicate with you, especially during an incident, they're not going to feel good about where they are, what they're doing. And of course, it's going to lead to additional stress. So I'm going to use an example here that is pretty basic. As you might guess, it's going to be a ransomware type example. I'm not going to go into the specifics of the particulars of the ransomware. I'm just going to show you some common examples, right? Everything from WannaCry to the SolarWinds. The point is that all of these kinds of things now can lead to some form of ransomware where either our data becomes encrypted or it becomes a situation where the attacker first steals a bunch of data and then offers it back to you for a ransom. So it really becomes more of extortion. So the details aren't important. What is important here is I'm setting up a basic incident. So we've had an incident happen. One of these things has popped up on a machine. Somebody notices something really strange has happened. So, the question at that point becomes, what do we do now? What do we do? Well, we could do this. We could just walk away, right? That's usually not an option. I don't know about you, but I don't really want to just walk away and lose my job. We could panic and freak out. That's also not an ideal situation, right? We want to take a step back and think about this. I have a whole other talk. One of my hobbies is I've been a firefighter since 1997, and I have another talk that talks all about the similarities and differences of firefighting and information security incident response. I would say this is not the time to panic and freak out, and I talk a lot more about that in that particular talk. So instead, we're going to have to communicate something. Something bad has happened. Again, even if your role is you're it, and now you have to communicate to multiple levels within your org, or maybe your role is smaller and you're part of a larger group and there's multiple groups. You still may have to communicate to multiple levels within your organization. So let's talk about what it's like to have those communications, what kinds of things to focus on, and ultimately how we're going to get that message across. So these are the audiences. We're going to focus on the end user, mid-level management, and our executives. And the goal is going to be what we call framing the conversation, which is a really simple concept. Framing the conversation is just about what is important to them. That's how we're going to preface that conversation so that they're not sitting there wondering, when are they going to get to something I care about? You're going to jump right into that right away in a way that they understand. So in thinking about that, you want to anticipate, what questions might any one of these folks at any of these levels ask you. You also need to consider how and where you're going to communicate. That's called a communication channel. So does it make sense with certain individuals or groups to communicate on an internal website? I mean, depending on how bad the situation is, that might not be appropriate. Do you have to do some sort of a one-on-one presentation with somebody in upper management? It really is going to depend greatly on the situation. Is email appropriate? Maybe part of what is happening with this particular ransomware is the email system is impacted. So maybe that's not the best means. Maybe you have to get everybody in a room and have in-person conversations. Again, you have to consider that channel. And because I never want to leave this out, you can always try lawyer-approved carrier pigeons, if nothing else. So let's talk next about the end user. So what does the end user focus on? They normally want to figure out how this is going to impact their work completion. What is it they do and how are they getting it done? Will this incident impact their day-to-day activities? Your goal with these folks is to communicate to them what happened and why when you can. Now, that doesn't mean you tell them all the little technical details. Trying to explain SolarWinds to an end user, for example, no, you're probably not going to do that. But from the context, remember, we're talking about framing that conversation for them. So within that context, what happened and why for them? You want to use this as an opportunity for awareness training where you can. If what kicked off this incident is, a phishing message or some form of whether it's a phone call or somebody coming in and they're doing social engineering in some capacity, that's okay. Use this as an opportunity to teach, right? You're not going to call out the person or people that were specifically involved here. You're just going to say, this is what happened, this is why it happened, and give them those basics. You want to give them this information in a way that will be helpful for them both at work and at home. One of the things I do within my job at the University of Buffalo is I teach awareness stuff. And when I do that, I make a point of what I am teaching to not be just solely focused on work. I certainly talk about our different data classifications and how they need to avoid sending certain kinds of data in email, for example. However, that's really no different from what they should be doing at home. And the reality is, if you can encourage the right kind of behavior, it doesn't matter where it is. If they start doing the right thing on their own personal data because they care about that data, chances are with a little muscle memory, they're going to do the same thing in the office. So show it as a benefit to them. Hey, if you understand this and you do it the right way, this can protect you and the people you care about and your own information, not just that of your organization. You want to be effective and efficient whenever possible. So, and continuous as well. You don't want to send one message and then stop, because then people get antsy and they don't know what's going on. So continuous messaging is very important. So what do we mean by efficient? Well, be concise, right? Less is more. Again, like I was saying a moment ago, we want to tell them what happened and why, but they don't need all the technical details. They need to know what's relevant to them. Again, be judicious. We don't want to blame folks, whether it's management or other individuals. We don't want to provide irrelevant information to them. Sometimes this can be awkward because you will get asked questions, and your organization has to kind of dictate what you're allowed to say, but be thinking about this before it happens, not in the middle of it happening. And we've talked about patience, right? Be patient. Even if you have to explain it for the 300th time and you have to go in a closet and scream and tear your hair out and, beat the walls or whatever, it's really important to be patient. At the end of the day, you want to provide communication at a level that these folks can both understand and relate to on their level. And that can be a real challenge, as I mentioned before, for those of us in the tech field, because that's not what we're used to thinking about. And it's very easy to assume that other folks know what we know. And guess what? They don't. And in some cases, it's amazing what other folks know about other subjects that we don't, right? So keep that in mind. This is how we're not going to communicate with those folks, right? We're not going to scream at them. We're not going to talk down to them. We're not going to try to freak them out or frighten them. That doesn't help our cause in any way. So be upfront and honest. This whole idea of lies to children, that will come back to bite you. So don't lie about what's happening. You may have to omit certain things. That's not uncommon. You want to make sure right off the bat, you are addressing any kind of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, because this population in particular is going to be very susceptible to, how does this impact my job? What does this mean? Could I lose my job? Will the projects I'm working on, will something happen to them? As much as you can, you want to address that. And that may require a conversation with other people to be able to do that, right? Remember that perception is reality for your average end user. What they think they see, whether or not it's true, is their reality. And what that means is, if somebody reaches out to you and says, something weird is happening on my system, and from what they're telling you, it's probably nothing, they probably just hit the wrong keys, right? They hit a funny key combination and it caused a window to pop up, or it changed a menu view or something along those lines. You may recognize that as no big deal, but you never know what you might miss. So take the time and investigate, even if you know it's not a problem. Remember what I said earlier about trust and how important trust is. And any kind of security awareness is based on trust. It's really, really important. Folks need to feel like they can reach out to you and say, Houston, I think we have a problem. And the sooner somebody tells you that, the better off that your organization will be. All right, so moving on to middle management, right? Calm down, it's all good, we're fine. So middle management is typically focused on whatever their business process is. So are they that of some operational entity? Do they run HR? Is this IT? It's going to impact their department, and that's going to be their focus, right? They're not going to look at necessarily their day-to-day specific tasks. They're going to be thinking about what their overall business process involves and how this is going to impact that. Again, you want to speak to them at a level they can understand and relate to. So what does that mean? Well, again, we've already talked about that very specifically, but it probably means you're going to avoid things like geek speak, which we'll come back to. So no technical conversation with management unless you happen to know they are tech savvy. And that means they understand the kind of thing you're talking about. So there are folks who are in development, who do programming, and they may be amazing coders, and they may not understand anything about operational security directly. Maybe they do. Maybe they came out of some kind of role where, they spent time researching security things. The point is, don't take it for granted. Don't assume. This is how we're not going to communicate with middle management, right? We're not going to do the chicken with the head cut off, because that's not helpful. We're not going to run around and scream, oh my God, the sky is falling, because that'll just cause them to say the sky is falling. and that doesn't help anybody. So with ideal middle managers, the ideal middle manager is phenomenal at delegating. They have amazing interpersonal skills. They're very effective with communication. They can negotiate like the best of them. They have outstanding emotional intelligence, and they are fantastic influencers. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd say this is a space. Now, I can tell you right now, the manager I have is spectacular. And he's probably as close to this as I've seen in a very long time. But the reality is, it's not very common. So we're going to talk about engaging with your regular middle manager, right? Not the perfect one who's really good at all of the things, but maybe who is good at some of those things. Because ideally, that's why they're in middle management, though we all know that that's not always the case. You want to be supportive of these mid-level managers. You want to work with them to come up with some kind of action plan. If you're talking about IT, this could be an action plan to deal with exactly what's happening, whatever this incident is. It could be giving them the information they need to make an action plan for their own unit. But it's got to include communication that goes up and down the chain. Don't leave those users in the dark. Remember how important we talked about that communication being continuous? That's where this kind of comes together, right? So both telling the folks above these mid-level managers what's going on and the folks below them is critical. And more critical is empathy. Middle management is a really, really hard job. The folks who are above middle management, they want to stay there and they want to push mid-management down. That's at least typically the thought process. Of course, not every manager's like that, but you know, your typical folks in executive positions don't necessarily want to be kicked out by somebody beneath them. And the folks who are below mid-management are in many cases trying to get into middle management. So they're often caught between a rock and a hard place, and it can be a really big challenge. So empathy is important. You want to make whatever you discuss with them and whatever plan you come up with, it should make them look good. Because guess what? That will ultimately make you look good. So what is that plan going to include? Well, at a minimum, it's going to be a description of the incident, again, in that context of what they care about. Ultimately, you want to think about all the stakeholders that are involved. Are there internal and external stakeholders? You could very well have a situation where you're calling in law enforcement. So how is that going to play a role? Are there board members you have to think about? Are there other entities that are tangential to your organization this could impact? So you need to be thinking about all of those stakeholders. And if you're in a main security role or you're all by yourself, this becomes even more critical. And it's tough to think about in the moment, right? So if you can be thinking in an incident who you need to gather together so that that communication plan includes those folks, and you think about this in advance, that will only help your cause. Now, with regard to the specific incident, consider the recovery options and timeframes. And that doesn't mean the best possible option or the worst possible option. It's all of the options. And how can we keep this from recurring? Was this a single action that showed some sort of gap in a process? Was this something where there was a gap in technology? What's the likelihood of this happening again? So you want to reduce that, and you want to talk about how that's going to be done. And the end goal, what is the end goal? Is the end goal to get to a certain point in the incident with these folks, or is the end goal getting all the way through the incident? This is going to differ depending on what's happening in your organization in general. If it's the case of ransomware, and it's, say, a department-specific ransomware, where maybe you have, 20 or 30 people impacted, a department share, but it hasn't become entity-wide. So the end goal may be to get those systems off the network, cleaned up, in the sense that, they're completely rebuilt from scratch. You recover data from backups and you're good to go. Maybe it's a global outage and the end goal is to get just some basics up and running. Again, it's going to vary, but you're going to need to work with these mid-level managers to discuss that. Managers do need to be accountable for user behavior, and that does not mean we point fingers. It means they need to be aware of the strengths and weaknesses of those folks, right? And if you have folks that are challenging, and I think we all know at least one person who falls in that role, you need to figure out how they're going to manage them. And the mid-manager may look to you for assistance with this, but management needs to take that responsibility. So these are some questions that you want to be thinking about and asking, right? How are potential ransom payments going to be handled? Don't ask this question when it's on the table. I mean, ultimately, of course you will, but think about this in advance. What are the situations in which you absolutely wouldn't have a choice? And maybe you'll see a situation you'd never even thought of, but think about that. Is there a case where that would be a thing? And if so, how are you going to handle that? Are you working with an insurance company where they bring in another organization that handles that? Is the answer just straight up, nope, we're never paying a ransom? And now, of course, there are legal liabilities if you pay a ransom, or at least there is legislation that suggests as much, right? So some other things you want to ask, is this something where we can collaborate with another unit? So is mid-management going to manage all of whatever they're working on, or are they going to delegate some of this out? Are they going to delegate, or are they maybe going to negotiate with another entity, whether it's internal or external, to help? And these are all decisions that mid-level managers are going to need to think about and make decisions about during an incident. All right, top of the tree here. Let's talk about those executives. Executives require a little more finesse because they're looking at that big picture, the overall company's goals, reputation, performance, their vision, and they have very little time. Now, obviously, in certain situations, they may make more time for you than usual. However, you still want to think you've got 30 seconds in an elevator. So let's imagine you're going to hang out with Fido here in the elevator and, some executive in your organization. How are you going to tell them what they need to know in approximately 30 seconds? Now, that's not to say that at the end of that, they might not ask you for more, but imagine that's all you have. So you need to do your homework. You need to understand as much as you can about these individuals. You don't want to wait until you're in the middle of this. Understand how your executives like communication, because you might have communication options depending on what is going on for the channel, right? Maybe this individual really, really, really hates one-on-ones or really, really likes one-on-ones. So remember when we were talking about the communication channel? Well, you're going to consider both the situation itself and the people you're talking to in terms of what might the best option be. You want to enter and exit gracefully, regardless of what they say to you, the tone of voice they use. Be professional. It can be very frustrating if you're not taken seriously, or if somebody's panicking, you don't want to respond in kind. So think about that. You're going to present and discuss strategically if they ask you to talk further. Write about that particular information that you started with the 30 seconds, right? So if they do want to talk further, and whatever you say, it needs to involve some sort of strategy. And at the end of the day, remember, these people, they're just people too. Many of them have families and home lives, and it can be really easy to lose sight of that because they're the big boss so-and-so, but they are people. This is the kind of thing your executive will probably want to know. They're going to want a non-technical description of what happened and when. Non-technical. Even at the, say, CIO level, they may want non-technical because their strength may be in business, not so much the actual technology itself. Remember when we talked about the possible options at mid-level management? Well, this is where you're going to potentially provide this additional information. Maybe you're at that level. You're going to give them the best case and the worst case, and what's most likely. And ideally, the consequences of what happened and underlying causes if you know them. And again, you're going to leave out technical jargon. We're not going to dive too deeply into this. You're going to do it from that big picture. So when speaking to executives, we're going to avoid the techno babble. We're going to avoid the geek speak, the lingo, our buzzwords, right? All of this kind of stuff gets in the way of us communicating that message. So which executive should you get that message to? Well, you want to make sure that ultimately, if it's a large company-wide incident, you want to get it to all of these groups because finance may be impacted. What we saw recently with the pipeline, right? The issue there, the initial issue there was quite frankly, their billing system went down. Well, that's finance, right? But operations is impacted because it's going to impact whether it's some portion of the org or a larger portion of the org, probably is going to impact their operation from some perspective. You may need to let HR know. This is going to depend on the size of the incident and how many folks are involved. You certainly want your heads of marketing or communications or PR, whatever you have, and maybe you have all three, and this will depend again on their function in your organization, but those executives should understand that there's something happening. Legal, certainly. And in fact, I would probably bump legal up the food chain to one of the highest parts because, especially if you're going to be dealing with any kind of legal ramifications from something like ransomware, you're going to need legal and you're going to need them to understand what's going on so they can advise you properly. And of course, if you haven't already told IT, they should know too, right? So the question is, we've gone to each of these groups. We've discussed, or maybe, you went to one group and a coworker of yours went to another, and you've told them all of these things. You've given them the right information. You've tried to relay the best you can what you understand about this. You've tried to frame it in the best possible way for them to understand it. The question is, just because you said it, does it mean that they understood it? So whether or not they got the message, you may not know. One of the ways we can know whether a message is received is nonverbal communications. Now, obviously, we talked about these different channels, right? These different communication channels. You're not going to have a sense of nonverbal communication if it's just an email. You're not going to have this if it's in some other messaging, Teams app, perhaps, where it's just some sort of text. It can be very difficult to read any kind of nonverbals, and we can misread that very easily. But if there's any kind of one-on-one, whether it's in person or over Zoom, for example, or some other mechanism, there's usually some nonverbals, and that's what we're going to talk about next. We want to pay very close attention to body language, right? I mean, look at these faces. You know what's going on with these kids, right? You know who's really angry, who's quizzical, who's surprised. We can see that in their body language. So it includes all of these kinds of things, whether it's facial expressions or posture, the kind of gestures we make. It can come across in something as simple as a handshake or how someone is breathing. So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. So how do we interpret these nonverbal cues that we see? Because people give nonverbal cues all the time. So what happens if somebody has raised eyebrows, right? How do we interpret that? Well, the problem is there's multiple ways that many of these things can be interpreted. Raised eyebrows can be, surprise. They can be doubt. They could be some form of discomfort. If I'm staring right into your eyes and I don't blink and there's excessive eye contact, is it because I'm like super interested in what you're saying? Or is it because I'm really trying very hard not to let you know that I'm lying to you? Because if I stare right at you, maybe you'll think, I'm giving it my all and it doesn't matter. And, that can be misleading. What about crossed arms and legs? I think we've all gone into meetings where people cross their arms and legs. So Does that mean they necessarily are closed to an idea, which is a cue we can get from that? Or did someone turn the heat off in a room and it's cold? Or, just maybe somebody's not feeling well. Maybe their mind's a million miles away. Same thing with exaggerated nodding. If I'm doing this all the time, am I just really nervous about whether or not you're accepting my idea? Or am I super excited about what you're saying? The point is that any one of these cues can be misleading. So we need to think about what we call nonverbal cues. And that's this idea where we read the person and the situation and we sort of blend it together, right? So if we have a situation where somebody has their eyebrows raised, their eyes are looking all over the place, and they're maybe gripping something really hard, odds are, if all of those things come together, there's a sense of discomfort. So we need to take each one of those cues and pull them together as opposed to just looking at them individually. All right, so I'm going to wrap up here. One of the things I want to make sure to get across is that our job, I believe very strongly that our job in security is to educate. That's my number one job. All the technology stuff I do throughout my day, and I do a whole bunch, I wear tons of hats in our office because we have very few people. I do incident response, I do forensics, I do awareness, I do all kinds of things. But regardless of which of those technical things I'm doing or non-technical things I'm doing, I believe my job is to educate. If I'm writing a forensics report, it's to educate through my words. If I'm giving a talk, I'm trying to educate through the verbal word as opposed to the written word. We are not there to adjudicate. Incidents are hard. Nobody, I think, really enjoys walking into an incident and having to be, kind of in the middle of that and the stress of the incident. I mean, certainly those of us who are incident responders, there is a certain excitement, and I can't deny that there are people who really enjoy that rush, and that's awesome. But everybody else is probably really uncomfortable. And so remember that. We don't want to be the folks who are making judgment. We want to learn what other people know. One of the jobs that I had early on when I was doing support, I worked for an entity that was a government contractor. And the jokes people like to make about it's not rocket science? Guess what? These folks were rocket scientists, and they were super duper smart. Guess what I don't know a whole lot about? Rocket science. Guess what they didn't know a whole lot about? Computing, day-to-day desktop computing. Boy, did they know their rocket science in that level. But, using Microsoft Word, that was a little more challenging. So I taught them about how to do what they needed to and the tools that they were given for that purpose. And they taught me some cool things, about rocket science. Now, I'll be honest, I don't remember a whole lot about it right now. But the reality is we need to share our knowledge. As I mentioned before, we really don't know what they don't know, and they don't know what we don't know. And so communicating and sharing, communication is absolutely a two-way goal. You want to share information. You want that person to give you some feedback so that you know in some capacity that they understood you, and vice versa. I'm a big proponent of be that change. You see folks out there who, treat folks not well. Don't be that person. And I'm gonna skip the question slide because we're gonna go do that online. But I want to end with this thought, this Douglas Adams quote, because as I mentioned, I started my journey in security really with end user and server support. That's where I started. And I had no idea I was even going to go there. I have my initial degree is actually in music industry. I have several other degrees that have nothing directly to do with security. But I think ultimately, regardless of that, I ended up where I needed to be, which is why I love this quote. And with that, I will thank you very much for coming to hear me today.